Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. In recent months, there's been rumors that Nintendo will be making a Zelda-related announcement sometime yet this year, even though Tears of the Kingdom just came out a few months ago. I don't think it'll be an announcement for a new Zelda game. I would guess that it's DLC or a remake for an older Zelda game. After all, Tears of the Kingdom took half a decade to make. But it's got me wondering about what their next game will be like. And obviously, so soon after Tears of the Kingdom, it's going to be mostly impossible to determine anything for sure about the next Zelda installment, but it's fun to speculate, and I think we can make some decent guesses as to what we should expect for the next Zelda game. Nevertheless, this is mostly speculation. We're basically just looking at what Nintendo is likely to do and what it's unlikely to do. What's the gameplay going to be like? Where's the story going to go? Will we have a new iteration of Link and Zelda, or will we stick with the ones we already have? Nintendo has stated that they intend to stick with the open world style of Zelda game, and this is awesome, but there is one major pitfall that Nintendo needs to avoid that I think they will, and that's that the next Zelda game needs to be careful not to be Breath of the Wild 3. Now, what do I mean by that? Tears of the Kingdom is a great game, but it borrows a lot from Breath of the Wild, and I mean a lot. The game innovated enough that it's still absolutely worth playing. It might be the best game released this year, but it has a surprising amount of repeated ideas from Breath of the Wild. While Breath did a lot to revitalize the Zelda series' formula, Tears of the Kingdom uses more or less the same formula as Breath of the Wild. The next Zelda game cannot do this. Tears already risked feeling formulaic, and I definitely think it just feels like Breath of the Wild 2 in a lot of ways. And a third title that borrows so much will almost guaranteedly have problems with feeling redundant and lazy. And I think Nintendo is smart enough to know this. But the question immediately arises, what would need to change? Well, there's the obvious things that most people will think of, and that's the issues that both games have. The ones that immediately come to mind are combat and armor imbalance and weakness in story structure. And there are many other problems that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom share, and it would be great if the next game could address those issues. So the most obvious change perhaps would be to just fix all the things that both games did wrong. But I think it is of even more importance to make a game that is separate from the other two. A game that has its own identity. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are different in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of similarities that people took issue with, and Tears of the Kingdom definitely feels more like Breath of the Wild 2 than Legend of Zelda number 20. And while most of us kind of gave Tears of the Kingdom a free pass on some of the copy-pasting done because of all the new stuff it did, I don't think any of us are going to be very eager to just accept basically the same game again with some extra fancy mechanics. What made Breath of the Wild as good as it was and as good as it still is how it innovated and tried new things, and one of Tears of the Kingdom's biggest weaknesses is how little it tries to continue that. The next Legend of Zelda game cannot be Breath of the Wild 3. It's got to do some things different to make itself unique, and I think Nintendo is very aware of this. But what could Nintendo change to achieve uniqueness in the next game? This is where we start to get into some speculation. There's a few different things that come to mind. These are things that I think would get very repetitive if a third game in the series had them. The system for combat, the shrines, the dungeons, and the storytelling. But there is one more important than any of these, and that is the world. One of Tears of the Kingdom's greatest weaknesses, after the aforementioned, was that the world was basically the same as in Breath of the Wild. They added the depths and the sky islands, but the majority of the main quest and side quests is still in the overworld. And as a result, for returning players, the overworld was stale. They'd already explored it, and while it was fun to see what had changed in the overworld, it's not the same as new exploration, and it never was going to be. Exploration is one of the main pillars of a good open world game, and Tears of the Kingdom didn't do it that well, and the next game can't afford to make the same mistake. The next Legend of Zelda game needs to take place in a very different world. And the Zelda franchise is no stranger to their games at least partially taking place in alternate realms, like the Twilight Realm in Twilight Princess, Lorule in A Link Between Worlds. In Majora's Mask, the entire game takes place in an alternate realm called Termina, which I think is the route that they should go with this. But there's other directions to take this as well. In Wind Waker, the location hasn't technically changed, but it's undergone such a radical transformation that it's not recognizable at first glance. The next Zelda would need something of this sort if it wants to maintain a good open world experience. I think that is the number one thing the next Legend of Zelda not only will do, but also needs to do for the health of the franchise as a whole. But what other new things might we see in the next Zelda? Suffice to say, just changing up the map and introducing a new story won't be enough on their own. Tears of the Kingdom changed runes to be much more versatile, so that Link could build a vehicle, fuse weapons together, and reverse time. It also replaced champion abilities with sage abilities, changed the style of dungeons to something that at least a few more people were happy with, and it had a lot more side quests. But what different things could the next game do? Maybe they'll throw out runes and sages and replace them with some other mechanics. But that's a level of detail I don't think we can really predict, and shouldn't hope too much that it's one way or another. I think as long as we don't have to run around to activate our sage's abilities, it's probably going to be an improvement over Tears. One really big change that I don't know if Nintendo is likely to change or not, but that I think a lot of people would like, is to change up combat. Combat in Breath and Tears is fun, but also flawed. But more importantly, it feels very similar between the two games, and I think that in this case, just changing up the formula is as important as anything else. Now, how could combat be changed? Well, there's a lot of different things. The next Zelda could have slow eating to slow down the healing and make it more dangerous in combat. If you ask me, that's something that should have been implemented in Tears because combat can get stale fast when all you have to do to stay alive is open up your menu and instantly eat a full course meal whenever you get hit. The armor system would be better off with an overhaul as well, as you can get to the point where even the final boss only deals 1 heart of damage per attack, and that's before you even have the fully upgraded set. Perhaps a more obvious thing that isn't so related to technicalities of the game mechanics would be adding or changing enemy types. One of Breath of the Wild's weaknesses was that it lacked enemy types at just 28. Tears of the Kingdom only slightly increased this number to 35. And regardless of those numbers, half the enemies you fight are still going to be bokoblins and Lysels. There's a ton of enemies from old games that the next Zelda could add into the world. Iron Knuckles, Vires, Bubbles. Dark Links could make for an awesome mini-boss, and if they spawned with a random assortment of the gear and armor you had acquired so far, they could scale up with you and remain fresh and challenging for many encounters, and fulfill a similar role in the game to Phantom Ganons in Tears. Or, if the next game takes place in a different realm, as I suspect it will, we could finally get some new kinds of enemies. If the next game is set in a different realm, there should be some creatures that are exclusive to that realm. Twilight Princess introduced new enemies like this to great effect with these shadow dog things. I don't even know what they're called, but they're an iconic staple of that game, and it'd be cool if the next Zelda game had something that was unique to it. Another thing that Nintendo could do that I thought was lacking in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is regional enemies. And I don't mean just elemental variants of existing enemies like electric Lysels and frost Gleeoks. I'm not saying that we can't have electric Lysels and frost Gleeoks, but the enemy pool in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom gets stale after a while, and regionally unique monsters could help a lot. Gibdos kind of fulfilled this role in Tears of the Kingdom, but I think that they could have gone further with that idea. But I think that the best change that they could make to combat, however, would be adding new kinds of weapons. And I know that that's sort of a half hot take. I know that there's a lot of people who think that Link's kit should go back down to just a sword and a bow. And I'm on board with making Link's kit simpler and more limited. Tears of the Kingdom Link got a little overpowered at the end, I thought. But a wider arsenal of weapons would definitely freshen up the combat a fair bit. And I don't just mean a dozen different flavors of polearms and longswords like we got in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Both of those games basically only have 3 melee weapon types: one-handed, two-handed, and spears. And while the damage was different for all of those, within each category everything was basically the same. What I'm imagining for the next game is like crossbows, and morning stars, and whips, and slingshots, and throwing knives, and scythes, and nunchucks, and Molotov cocktails, and Byzantine flamethrowers. And some weapons could have unique interactions within the game. Maybe you could use a whip to snag items that are out of reach, or to disarm enemies. Not only would this be incredibly cool, but I think that it would also help the new game with another problem that the other two games have. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom don't have particularly good rewards for exploring or for completing quests. This is one of the weakest points of those games, and after completing basically anything, the best you can hope for is for a shrine or maybe a new armor piece, and the normal rewards would be rupees, Korok seeds, and weapons that are going to break pretty soon anyway. Diversifying Link's armory is something that would possibly help with rewards, especially if there wasn't weapon durability, because that would mean that getting these unique kinds of weapons would be a permanent buff, and suddenly the incentive to go seek out these different weapons is much greater. And I think that it would freshen up the experience a lot. Another thing that they could do is remove weapon durability, and I'm not saying that this is what Nintendo should do, as I'm one of the people that actually likes weapon durability in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom because it keeps your arsenal fresh and changing. But it's not something that I would miss terribly either if it was gone. Once again, these are all just different ways they could change combat. I think they will change combat, but how they will do it is hard to say. These are just the things that come to mind. Let's move on from combat possibilities, though, to some other things. Another thing that I really think they should have done for Tears of the Kingdom after some backlash in Breath of the Wild is swap shrines for small dungeons. And I really think they should do this with the next Zelda game, and I think it is quite likely that they will. They would make a far smaller pool of small but aesthetically independent dungeons that give full heart containers instead of chunks once they're completed. Even if each dungeon was literally just 4 shrine puzzles with similar themes stitched together with 1 or 2 larger monsters sprinkled in, I think that it would still be a nice change, especially if there was some effort put into making each dungeon aesthetically different. And this is coming from someone who doesn't have strong feelings on Zelda dungeons in general. I don't have any kind of nostalgia for Zelda dungeons because before Breath of the Wild, the only Zelda game I'd played was the original Legend of Zelda from 1986, and I hated those dungeons. I just think that this would be a change that Zelda players as a whole would really like, and it would differentiate the new game from what we got in the last 2 Zelda titles. Related to this, we've heard a lot recently from the big-time Zelda fans that Nintendo needs to bring back linear dungeons. And after Tears of the Kingdom, I think we've all sort of figured out at this point that linear dungeons generally work better than open-style dungeons for this kind of game. And there can be a mix of the 2 styles of dungeons. They can take a compromise between the 2 if Nintendo really wants, but there should be probably at least a couple of linear dungeons in the next Zelda game. Unfortunately, I don't think that this is any more likely than any other entirely speculative possibility we've been through so far, but we can definitely hope. Another thing they could change is the art style, but I hope they don't. The cel-shaded graphics are great, and they let the system run much more simply. It doesn't take nearly as much processing power, and so it's not as nightmarishly hard to optimize. Let's move on to the next thing, though, and that thing will, as it happens, take up the entirety of the rest of the video. Where can Nintendo go with the story? When considering where the story could go for the next game after Tears of the Kingdom, the first question that likely comes to our minds is this: will we be seeing the same Link and Zelda, or a new incarnation of those characters at some other location in the timeline? For those of you who have only ever played Breath of the Wild and or Tears of the Kingdom, this may not be common knowledge to you, but the Link you play as in those games is not the same as in all the other Legend of Zelda games. Over the course of the 20 canonical games, there have been 12 different incarnations of Link and 13 different incarnations of Zelda. And with only one exception, there haven't been any incarnations of Link that have featured as the main character in more than 2 games. If Nintendo follows on their trend, then the next game will probably feature a new Link and Zelda, and Tears of the Kingdom will be the end of the story for the Link and Zelda that we have grown attached to. And it would be a good ending. Those 2 have been through way too much already. And another reason to believe that we'll get a new incarnation is because of the character's age. Link and Zelda have always been young characters in Zelda games, ranging from literally just kids to young adults. Ignoring the stasis period, Link is around 17 in Breath of the Wild, and anywhere from 3 to 10 years pass before Tears of the Kingdom, depending on who you ask. That puts Link anywhere from 20 to 27. Even at the low end, that's fairly old for Link, and if there's any significant time gap before the sequel, Link could potentially be in his early 30s, and I just don't think that Nintendo would do that. All other things aside, the question of whether the next Zelda game features the same protagonists or not is the main thing that will dictate what kind of story it is likely to tell. It would be typical and expected of Nintendo at this point to close the door on the current incarnation's story and start a new one. But there's a pretty big reason that I question this reasoning, and it has to do with the Triforce. The Triforce is the most iconic and identifiable item in The Legend of Zelda. Even non-Zelda players can look at the Triforce and say, hey, it's that thing from that one Nintendo game. And so it's incredibly odd to me that the Triforce is never directly mentioned in Breath or Tears. If you really look into the game's symbolism, it looks like Zelda may possess the Triforce unknowingly through Bloodline, but it's not confirmed. The main reason I think that we may have one more game with these 2 characters is to reveal this mystery of where the most powerful artifact in all of Hyrule is located. I could be entirely off on this. There's no technical rule saying that the Triforce has to show up again. It's possible that Tears of the Kingdom is the end of that storyline, and we'll never know 100% for sure where the Triforce is in Tears and Breath. But it is one of the most fundamental aspects of the Zelda series. Nintendo leaving this story with its current iteration of Link and Zelda without even mentioning the Triforce just doesn't make much sense to me. It has foundational significance to the lore and to the very existence of that world, so it would be incredibly strange for it to fade out of the narrative completely. And it would make a fair amount of sense to make one more game with these characters that somehow involves the Triforce. So the way that I see it, we have two very possible future Zelda games. In the first, Nintendo would make a new incarnation of Link set somewhere else in the timeline. That new incarnation would be able to battle foes that were already seen in the current iteration like Ganon or Ganondorf if Nintendo wanted to do that. The second possibility, though, is that we get a third game with the current Link and Zelda, in which there is some other enemy involved and the Triforce is a key part of that story. This second possibility is much narrower and thus easier to theorize about what it might contain story-wise, so I'm going to focus on that possibility. The very first thought I had when I considered Tears of the Kingdom sequel possibilities was the question of, who would the villain be? The most common villain in Zelda games is Ganon/Ganondorf, but Link has already defeated both versions of the demonic warlord in his current incarnation. One possibility that definitely comes to mind is that Demise, the villain of Skyward Sword, would be the new villain. Demise is the originator of the curse that causes all these incarnations of Link and Zelda to have to fight so many monsters, so he would make a suitable final boss for this incarnation. Now, Demise is canonically very dead, but there is a reason to believe that he could return in the next Zelda. When Demise was killed in Skyward Sword, his spirit was trapped within the Master Sword, and the Master Sword was moderately damaged in Breath of the Wild and thoroughly ruined in Tears of the Kingdom. If this weakened the seal on Demise's soul in any way, then we could see his return. I'm going to go off on a bit of a side tangent here, but I think it would be really cool if Demise returned in the next game and actually controlled and wielded the Master Sword for a while, and one of the main quests was basically purifying the corruption of the Master Sword and then going on a second quest to steal it back from whatever layer Demise is keeping it in. Demise isn't the only possibility, though. Throughout the Zelda franchise, we have seen a small handful of extremely powerful dark wizards take on the role of main antagonists. The standouts that are main villains of their games are Aghanim and Vati the Wind Mage. A wizard like this may not seem at first glance like they're as powerful of an enemy as, say, Ganondorf, but once again, this would be a game where the Triforce would probably be in play, and a dark wizard with one or more pieces of the Triforce would prove a plenty formidable foe for our current incarnation of Link. It would also potentially give the game a very aesthetically and stylistically different enemy than Ganon or Ganondorf. I think most likely for the next Zelda game, if it's the same incarnation of Link, we will either have Demise or a dark wizard as the villain. But there is always the possibility of some wildcard. Twilight Princess's most active antagonist was Zant, and he's unlike any other villain in the Zelda series. I don't think it's likely, but Nintendo could once again cook up a villain that's actually unique. Not that a dark wizard can't be unique, and Demise has only been in one game, so it wouldn't feel as copy-paste as reusing Ganon, but a completely new villain could be really refreshing for the next Zelda game, and it's definitely a possibility that Nintendo will cook up something new. Anyway, that's my thoughts on what the next Legend of Zelda might be.